This particular session, we're very excited about it. This is an opportunity not only for the faculty in MST, which is Mathematics, Science, and Technology, to come together to discuss some things that we've been talking about for a little while, but it also is an opportunity to engage the conversation with you too. So in our department, we have been having conversations about STEAM as well as STEM, and what's the difference, how are they different, how do they come together? And so again, you're gonna have the opportunity to engage with us as we engage with each other around some of the discussions that we've been having in the department. There will be 3 rounds of questions that I will ask to my colleagues, but then there will also be a 4th round. This 4th round is for you to engage with us as well. So I'm going to tell you what the 3 rounds of questioning will be. We'll give you an opportunity to write down your questions for either of the rounds, but for round 4, it's you. You get an opportunity to ask questions to engage with us. So for this round, and I also would like I guess I should have them introduce themselves too. So they're just going to introduce themselves when I tell them to introduce themselves. They're just going to tell their name, tell their program, because we have a number of different programs within our department, and then they're going to share one fun thing they did that could be considered STEAM. So we can start thinking about that. But for the questioning, we will have the 3 rounds, as I mentioned. Round 1 would be, what does STEAM mean? Round 2 is, what problems can STEAM solve? And then round 3 is, what are exciting new ways to think about STEAM education for now and in the future? So I'd like to welcome my colleagues to the forum as well. And so they're just going to, again, say their names, their program, and then they're going to tell you what did they do for STEAM this week. And so we'll start. I don't know, let's start at the end. This is our department chair as well, so Erica Walker.
Thank you very much. I'm Erica Walker. I'm very happy to be here. And I am in the program in mathematics education. I'm a professor in that program, as well as being the department chair. And I will say that something fun related to STEAM this week. Last night, actually, I went to a museum here in the city, the Frick collection, which is amazing if you haven't been. And we looked up, and there was a music concert in the music room, which is a very sort of beautiful, architecturally just gorgeous room. And the acoustics in this room were so amazing. As I was enjoying the music, I found myself looking at the room because it was also a perfectly round room. And I started thinking about, is that why the acoustics are so great in here? And I started thinking about, how could we test that? What could we do with young kids to think about a rectangular box room like this one, the acoustics in those rooms, versus do we need some rounded corner to make the sound bounce better and to sound so great? So that was really fun for me, in addition to going to the Frick to see art and thinking about these sort of STEAM questions as I was listening to that great concert.
My name is Nick Wasserman. I'm also a faculty member in the program in mathematics. I'm an assistant professor. Something fun related to STEAM. This is nowhere near the fun that Dr. Walker just described, but in preparation for the STEAMnasium, which is later today, I've been designing some activities that use technology to explore mathematical ideas. And I had both my parents, who happen to be in town, who haven't seen or thought about mathematics in a long time, and my young children kind of explore and engage with those. And it was fun for me to see how they engaged with some of those ideas. So.
Hi, my name is Jana Literat. I'm an assistant professor in the Communication, Media, and Learning Technology Design program. Something fun related to STEAM that I did this week. I'm going to talk about something fun that's not related to my research, even though I think that my research in relationship to STEAM is fun too. But since last Sunday was Easter, last weekend I made an Easter wreath. And I crafted it. I'm really into crafting recently. And I shared my design in an online crafting community on Reddit. I got solutions to problems I was facing, like how to position the bunny so that he's seen well from all sides, kind of problems you would encounter making an Easter wreath. And then afterwards, I also uploaded my final design, and we talked about it together, which was really fun, and I'm happy with the final product.
Hi, I'm Sandra Okita. I am an associate professor in the Communication, Media, and Learning Technologies Design program. I am also the program coordinator. So the fun thing that I did, STEAM related, is yesterday I went to go see Ready Player One in 4DX. Was that necessary? I'm not quite sure. But what was interesting is that it showed a lot of the interaction between the technology developer as well as the user. They used VR technology to augment physical and cognitive abilities in human. They also showed data mining, which has a lot to do with computational mathematics, as well as the, I guess, ethical dilemmas that are involved in using this type of technology and who's going to run it. So I feel that is the full STEAM right there. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's not a competition. You don't have to win.
That's the key phrase.
Hi, I'm Nathan Holbert. I'm an assistant professor in the Communications, Media, and Learning Technologies Design program as well. Something STEAM related. My daughter the other day said to me, she's 3 years old, she says, "Daddy, I want to make a robot." And I was like, awesome, let's definitely make a robot. And so we spent the weekend, she and this was all her, she designed it on paper, with a marker. She drew what she wanted her robot to look like and what she wanted her robot to do. And then we got cardboard. We had some microcontrollers lying around because that's the kind of person I am. And we made a little robot together. And it was awesome and cute and fun. And we did all sorts of, math, and we did some programming together. And lots and lots of art involved in it as well. And we had a great time.
Okay. So thank you, colleagues, for that. So I asked this question to them because I wanted you also to see how much STEAM is connected to our personal lives on a daily basis. And so for you to think about where are those connections to STEAM in your lives, and also connection to young people. It's good to see some young people. I saw a couple walk in. And so to have them also present to think about the experiences that they have with STEAM. So now I want to get to some questions around what does STEAM really mean? How do we think about it? What does it mean? So it's represented by 4 different areas when we say STEAM as science, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics. But what does that really mean to us in our daily work and also even our personal work? Anybody?
I can start. So I think for me, it's a question of what should it ideally mean, and then what does it often mean in practice, the way that it's talked about. For me, ideally, it's about creating connections between disciplines, moving us from subject-centric to, or at least towards, a people-centric form of education and view on education. I think in practice it's often associated with economic discourses, and I think that's where a lot of the problems stem from that we're going to be talking about today too, that it's an educational construct, but it's also an economic imperative or an economic construct. And I think it's 2 other caveats I want to mention very quickly. I'm sure we'll come back to these issues in this panel. One, I do think it matters in terms of defining the terms. It matters if we talk about STEM versus STEAM. To me, I think those 2 terms do have really important definitional and also definitional aspects and also aims and what they're trying to achieve, what they're trying to tell us. And second, that it means different things to different people. So to us as scholars, researchers, professors, educators, it might mean one thing. It might mean something else to policymakers, to administrators, to parents, to students themselves. So it's also really important to acknowledge these differences of interpretation and how and why they're valuable.
Yeah, one of the things that I think has become increasingly apparent to me as we've discussed STEAM and STEM in some of our department meetings is related to what Jana said. To me, I actually see them as fundamentally sort of different ideas, that they're not necessarily a modification of one, that STEAM wasn't a modification of STEM. And I don't necessarily see them as competing either. I just see them as very different. So STEAM to me signifies this idea of interdisciplinariness. This idea that the study of the arts in education is benefited through the study of mathematics or economics or biology, that when we think about education, these interdisciplinary connections are really meaningful and valuable in all facets. STEM to me was a uniting around topics that have some sort of inherent connectedness and has some similar interdisciplinary idea that the education in science, technology, engineering, and math should benefit from each other. But to me, they started from two different places, and that's been an interesting thing for me to kind of think through.
Okay, so when I think of STEM, I might think about the product, like creating a robot, right? And then, or any kind of technological artifact that uses science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But when I think of STEAM, then it brings in the user. And so it no longer becomes just the design of the artifact or product, but it's designing the relationship between the artifact and the user. And so that's where I put in the A.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking a fair amount about the difference between STEM and STEAM and how I feel about the difference between STEM and STEAM. I've never really been, intimately connected to the acronym of STEM. It sort of felt like an arbitrary set of letters that got put together for all sorts of interesting, perhaps political reasons. And so if you wanted to add an extra letter to it, it's like, sure, I guess that's fine. We could call it STEAM. I've been arguing for meats for a while. It hasn't caught on yet. Perhaps it will, though, after this week. But I think even despite the fact that maybe they came together, these letters come together for political reasons or sometimes arbitrary reasons, I think they communicate something, and we need to sort of think deeply about what they communicate and whether or not we feel strongly about that communication. And I think when I think about the difference between STEM and STEAM, for me, and I think others have echoed this as well, it's sort of a difference between a focus on economics versus a focus on humanity, right? And I think that matters. So STEAM kind of being conceived of as an educational effort to focus our attention on the concepts, the practices, the domains that are important for technological innovation or for economic prosperity. But when you add that A, and as Jana said, I think you recenter humanity there, right? You reattend to the fact that these innovations, these tools, these environments, and to also echo Sandra here, they're used by thinking and feeling humans, right? And that strikes me as something that matters. And I also want to just quickly note that when we talk about these things being used by humans or these things being designed for humanity, we have to be talking about all humanity, right? And when we think about STEM, I think it's always important for us to suggest that we should care about things like social justice and we should care about equity. But I think STEAM necessarily needs to focus or necessarily attends to social justice and humanity. And so by putting that A into that conversation there of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, I think it refocuses our attention to the lives of all humans and to the values and practices that are tied up with those particular domains as well.
Yeah, thank you, colleagues, for all of that. So I know in the audience we have teachers that are present and other educators. Could you offer us some examples of what a STEAM curriculum could possibly look like? What can they do in their practice to emphasize a STEAM focus in their classrooms?
I will just follow up briefly on the previous comments about the importance of our discussions in our department to create a space for us to talk about STEM and STEAM through our work and to think about how to make our work more interdisciplinary. And I think something that echoed throughout all of the responses to the last question was about being invitational. And I think there are some other disciplines that are much better at inviting people to come in and to learn through their philosophies and to do the work and to teach all students. And I think STEM and STEAM both have some work to do in that regard. And so when we talk about opportunities and opportunities that people, not just young people in school, but people in the world and adults have to develop their knowledge of these very important concepts, we want to provide a sort of lifelong learning lens and be invitational about bringing people into our fields. And curriculum is one way to do that, and I think people will have things to say about that.
I think in thinking about the 5 components of STEAM, another important and interesting question that comes up is usually, at least rhetorically, if you look at the discourses around it, the A and the T are often means to an end, right? Using arts and using technology to achieve these STEM or STEAM-related outcomes. So in thinking about curriculum, I would also push back, I don't know if push back or just push against that a little bit so that we can think more critically and more reflexively. Are they things in themselves, or are they means to other things?
So the second round of questioning is going to be around what problems can STEAM solve? What problems can STEAM solve? So what questions are asked and potentially addressed when we think about and consider STEAM? Or what kinds of problems should people be able to solve because of STEAM? Colleagues?
I have actually been thinking about this a lot for a number of, I think, very good reasons related to politics in this country. And there's a lot of discussion around media literacy and sort of thinking about people really need to have STEM literacy in combination with media literacy. And so the types of arguments that are made for and against certain policy proposals, if we did a better job as educators and researchers of designing curriculum with a big C, so not just textbooks or other things that people get in school, but ways to help people understand the importance of a STEM-based argument for and against something with facts and evidence and data. So I think it's becoming really critical. It's always been critical, but I think it's becoming even more critical in this particular era of back and forth and labeling things fake news and labeling things, quote, bad science or junk science. So I think that's one implication. Excuse me.
So I think one question that we had was what kind of problems do they solve? Or I see many, not really solve, but has potential to address or kind of move towards solving. I think one is in the area of careers, interest in STEM careers. So I know children pretty early on in their elementary school may deselect the STEM career. One, because one of the reasons they say is possibly because they don't see themselves in a particular career area. And they might study math, they might study each of the STEM areas, but they're not really able to picture themselves of applying that to a real world setting. And I think the STEAM, what it does is it shows how it can be applied to the real world setting, and then certain areas such as biomedical engineering or genomic research or pharmaceuticals, those are all very much interdisciplinary areas that are fastly growing. And so I think it will allow them to see the STEM, each of the subjects that they are studying is a form of tool or a skill that they are using to resolve certain problems in the real world. And I think as Nick mentioned, the interdisciplinary nature of these growing industries kind of show that. So I feel that could help. Another thing I've noticed is what kind of problems. So for example, if you're doing like genetic research, the reason why I'm saying this is I had a graduate student from Science Ed, Adam Stefanil, yes, had come to me because he's taking one of my courses and he's trying to figure out how does technology play a role? How can we create specific STEM stream related artifacts in relation to spreading out or helping the K through 12 schools study genome research or putting that into their curriculum. And it gave us a good amount of time to think about, okay, if you want to do genomic research or genetic engineering, you have to use computational mathematics, right? That speeds up the process. You have to see patterns, right? And so that can tell how each of these things can be a very strong tool to resolving certain problems within the real world. So those are the few points.
I would just like to pick up on one theme that Sandra mentioned in terms of young people knowing about STEM careers and STEAM careers. And it's not just about sort of being career ready, it's about being life ready. being college ready, being community ready, as one of our colleagues who's in the audience says, Linda Peruto. And I think popular culture is a really important mechanism for promoting representations of people doing STEM and STEAM. There have been a number of films recently that have come out that really highlight women, for example, in these STEM careers. And through their storytelling, they're inviting young people and not so young people to see themselves in a different way and to be curious about things they may not have been curious about before. I'm thinking particularly about the movie Hidden Figures and the Black Panther film, and how the representations of science and scientists are really important. And you see this interdisciplinary work happening on screen and behind the screen, which I think is very compelling and can be compelling to young people as well.
I want to add on that too. Who participates in these domains, and who designs, and who are the engineers, or who are the scientists? Like, those things definitely matter, right? Those things matter for what we create, and those things matter for whether or not the things that we create actually represent the people that live in the world, right? Because we're a very diverse bunch that live on this rock that flies through space, right? So I think we need to be thinking about not just how do we who is represented in these spaces, but also I think we need to open up our perspectives on what counts as STEM a little bit. The thing that we usually consider STEM comes from a pretty specific framing, traditionally kind of Western idea of what it looks like to do science or what it looks like to do mathematics. There's a certain kind of a person that we imagine that does STEM. And there's often good reasons why those particular perspectives have become dominant within STEM, but we often don't question whether or not those are the only perspectives that could have value for doing STEM and for innovating in these domains. And so I think one thing that adding that A does is also trying to open our eyes up to places where STEM is happening that we don't traditionally look. We might try to find new models of STEM that are out there that would, I think, inform how we engage in these practices, and that would bring new people into the fold of these domains and of these communities that we sort of set for ourselves. And doing so will necessarily lead to interesting, I think, innovation. If we kind of keep this place closed off, we're going to kind of keep creating the same things, and those are going to be just for a small segment of the population, right? So we do necessarily need to open up our eyes to new and novel forms of practices of STEM in other places for us to really move forward and to innovate.
And you actually touched upon, Nathan, the third area of the conversation. And so as we're a little bit limited in time, because we started a little bit late, because we also wanted to have an opportunity to really engage your questions, engage the conversation with you. And so that last point that Nathan made, it was around the area of what does STEM, how can we see STEM in the future? What are the ways that STEM might be more motivating to young people? Might it be more engaging to young people? And so, as I said before, we have some young people in the audience, and sometimes young can be relative, right? Depending upon how you look at your age. But what are some new ways and exciting ways that we might be able to think about STEM education now and into the future?
So I'll tie in some of my comments to that new question, but thinking about the kinds of problems that STEAM might be able to solve, one of the things that strikes me is just that there are differences epistemologically between these different areas. There's differences ontologically. The difference between mathematics and science, these are areas of study because there are differences, and there's different approaches to solving problems across these different domains. And so one of the things that's exciting to me is just the idea that as you're accustomed to a particular kind of approach, a particular kind of framing of a problem, that by integrating domains, you get different perspectives on how to approach that same problem in a way that's necessarily beneficial. And so the kinds of problems that I think STEAM will be able to solve and the kinds of answers that I think it will be able to give are necessarily richer because they're providing different perspectives on the same topic. And so this is one of those areas, I think, when we think about education, that's important to kind of highlight that there's new ways of thinking it's not just the sum of 4 different discrete things, but that there's new ways of thinking formed by integrating these disciplines in education.
And I think if we're thinking about motivations for the students that are engaging in STEAM practices, a key one for me, also because of the kind of research that I do, is creative confidence and having new platforms to share their ideas in new ways to new audiences. My research looks at youth online creative participation. So in the kinds of online spaces that I look at, I see every day the kind of empowerment students derive from these platforms and how it can harness their creative voice, how it can harness their creative confidence. And if we put this in the context of STEAM and allow them to express themselves in these interdisciplinary ways to transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary audiences, this can facilitate a kind of creative confidence that I think cannot be facilitated in the same way through arts alone. Now, of course, it depends very much how we define that A or how we define the arts. And there's a lot of disagreement about this, I think, when thinking about STEAM. Do we define it just as art or arts or design thinking, which has itself become kind of a buzzword? Do we define it as humanities? Do we define it as everything that is not STEM? So then that's the A in STEAM. So I think these are all important questions, but for me, because of my research, I wanted to stress this idea of creative confidence and just the new forms, new audiences, new possibilities that STEAM-based expression can give to youth.
So there's a few things. So my research is using technological artifacts such as robotic systems. And the robot is a full STEM object because it involves a lot of things, technology, math, science, engineering, as well as the A, because when you develop these artifacts, for example, self-driving cars, that might be one thing where you have to come up with new policy, new regulations, new rules, and what is allowed and what's not. And so I think bringing students into a situation where they have to realize that this one topic area involves all these STEAM areas would help. And I think including that into the curriculum would help. Another thing is for the professionals in each of the fields, I think they have to have this open mind of the different methodologies that's been using, the evaluation, the type of data that they use. I think different types of data analyzed together could actually show you a whole different picture. So rather than just having our regular learning measures, we might have like physiological measures. We have all these different types of measures that will tell a story, a different story, or a new insight from a different angle. And so as, I guess, instructors, when we create curriculum, we should encourage those different methodologies, assessments, measures, and kind of worked with the students to kind of see what helps what.
Okay.
Some of my, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Some of my latest research has been exploring the use of storytelling for math learning and socialization. And I think that human beings are natural storytellers, and we invite this a lot when we do research or we teach in other domains. So there's a robust body of research in literacy, on literacy practices and how we facilitate those. And there's not really an analogous literature on math practices. And so my work on storytelling has evolved from a study I did with mathematicians who I interviewed about their formative and educational and professional experiences with mathematics. And they tended to tell a lot of stories. And the stories they told were about learning math both within school, but in also out of school spaces. So picking up on Nathan's point about looking for spaces that promote this kind of thinking, this kind of learning, that aren't maybe the traditional spaces that we think about, but are also more invitational. And so when I think about moving into a new direction for math education in particular, but also for STEM learning. I think this notion of honoring our humanness as storytellers and thinking about the stories that we tell about mathematics, what kinds of stories get told, what mathematics content can be gleaned from these stories. Quite a bit, actually, when we analyze them and look at them. So I suspect that, because I've already had some conversations with colleagues, that this could become a broader study around STEM stories and the stories that people tell about their engaging with these STEM concepts, and STEAM stories, which I think my first example of being in this concert hall might have been an example of a STEAM story, perhaps.
So as you're also thinking, I did pose 3 questions for you to think about if you did not have anything to think about, but think about this. What does STEAM look like in your own life? What are your ideas of STEAM? And what did you learn from the conversation today? So all of those could be opportunities for you to engage with us. So we have a person in the back that has the microphone. And if you can say your name.
Hi, I'm Christina Zoom. I am an alumna. I graduated in 2002. And I was a department chair, STEAM department chair at a high school in Brazil, São Paulo. We implemented the first STEAM curriculum. We had a high school of 2,700 students there, and we had a lot of challenges. And what you put in, we thought a lot about the STEM, the STEAM, and I loved how you put how it brings in the human design, because my background is in science, and we have a lot. Putting STEAM into a school brings a lot of opportunities. First of all, with the teachers themselves. So we spent a whole year with the teachers planning the curriculum. So we looked at a lot of schools, a lot of ideas, a lot of models of activities that were happening. We had robotics project, we had the science fair, we had a lot of things going on. But I think one of the main things that the STEAM curriculum brought was the opportunity for the teachers to work together, and the science teachers and the art teachers, and begin to learn about all these different perspectives, and how, if you think about a project, what the different perspectives can bring. And it was an amazing opportunity. We did use design thinking to build a curriculum. It's a buzzword, but it works really well because it does bring the human-centered design into the elements. The teachers had never worked thinking about that. And as we worked with the students, it also brings an opportunity to empower the students, because when you look at projects, that one of the things, the elements that's important to think about is that the students choose something that's significant to them. It has to make sense to them. And many students want to help the community they are in, and even though they were very well empowered students, from a high economical status, they began to realize the importance. So we would have students who would do projects like building an app to help elderly have some companionship. So we brought the emotional element into it. We had to think about social emotional learning. We had to grade them, so we had to think about assessment. How do you bring assessment into a STEAM curriculum? So I really thank you for all your perspectives and research, because all of this is part of a curriculum when you put it into a school. But you really have to involve all even the teachers, the students, the administrators, because it's a new culture in the school. And it's so important to look at, we had a hard time thinking about the contribution of the A, because we had the science fair, we had all those different science projects. But I really fell in love with the A of the STEAM, because that's when you brought in the human-centered design of the whole thing. So it's just I don't have a question really. I just want to share, but yeah. Thank you so much for that.
So we have lots of hands up.
Thank you very much. I also wanted to share my STEAM project. I teach writing for engineering. 10 years ago, when they gave me that course, I realized there is no poetry in the course material. I'm a poet. I'm also a minority. I come from a poetry culture. And I incorporated an assignment of poetry for engineering students, which is written about technical objects. And then I collect those poems and publish them in a journal of technical poetry. I call that technical poetry. So it is started from my practice of teaching, but it became my doctoral dissertation. I graduate this semester. I'm a PhD candidate in English education. Thank you very much. It's so great to hear the perspective of STEM scholars, but I believe STEAM can be also in humanities, or us English, we English teachers, teaching writing for engineering and science. And from poetry, as you said, is a channel that releases the students' imagination and creativity. It boosts their creative confidence. And more than that, they learn the metaphoric writing and metaphoric thinking that we poets use them. And we bring together seemingly disparate concepts. And in this comparison, the students can apply it actually in two ways. In their writing, they can, by comparing a complex technical or scientific concept to a similar concept that is more familiar, they can simplify and clarify these concepts in their technical writings for the broad audience of technical documents. And also, they can apply that in creative thinking. Like Eddie Stone, who designed and invented the first lighthouse, designed it, modeled it on oak tree, how oak tree can be resilient and strong in a storm. So such connections, we use them in poetry all the time, and it can be applied in science and technology and writing for science and technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to respond just briefly to that. It made me think of a few things that I think are really important that you brought up. You know, I think when we talk about STEM or the practices of science or engineering or any of the other fields, mathematics, we often assume that there's somehow this very technical, very sort of soulless kind of rigorous approach that we move through. And I think the actual practice of STEM professionals involves so much feeling and emotion. You know, there's a lot of interesting work around the way in which scientists use metaphors to try to make sense out of phenomena that they can't actually see or they can't actually touch. There's obviously been lots of work around things like Barbara McClintock, where you sort of have a feeling about how these plants or how this artifact or this phenomena is progressing. So I do think it's really important for us to not only talk about these things in terms of concepts and practices, but also in terms of sort of the ways in which we might use these concepts and practices from other domains, from the arts domains, to really do science, do mathematics in a professional way.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexander Harris Jr. I'm a graduating senior at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I think it's very important that we acknowledge the A in STEAM with the arts and whatnot. I'm also a poet, and a lot of my perspective comes from like a poetic background and acknowledging the humanness that Professor Holbert was talking about. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with the storytelling that you were talking about as well, and literacy. So, being that STEM is kind of gradually becoming STEAM, I kind of find it important that we continue to push that envelope and perhaps make STEAM into STREAM in adding reading and writing. So I'd like to know what you all think about how the language arts could potentially be added into the agenda and advance along with STEM and STEAM.
So maybe I can reply to that a little bit. So here at Teachers College, I teach elementary science methods courses. And in this particular class, we actually use a lot of books for the pre-service teachers to also read during story time with children. A little bit of that, getting that interest and motivation around learning. And then they have to take that text and actually think about what connections to STEM learning is related to that textbook. So for example, have you all heard about The Curious Garden? And some of you know about it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And it actually talks about a young boy who used things for recycling around learning science. And so the teachers, the pre-service teachers actually use the textbook as story time with the young children, and then develop a project for them to go through their neighborhood to look at different ways that they can think about recycling products that they actually found, that they were able to find in their neighborhood or at home. But it had a really great component to that around reading and writing. And they used also persuasive writing statements around why it was important to think about recycling, not only for their schools, but for their communities. So I've never thought about STREAM before, but I think it's really compelling. I think it touches upon the things that we've already been mentioning today about how do we expand these opportunities for young people and even ourselves to challenge and take risk around what do we really mean around STEM or STEAM? What are the different perspectives that can actually help us to broaden our ideas and also to broaden the ways that we're learning and teaching? So it gives me something to think about. Never heard of that before, but thank you for bringing that to our attention around STREAM. I think we probably are doing some of that, but not as explicitly calling it STREAM.
If I could add one more to that is I think terms are shared across. So when I take the term like culture, I think there's the international difference in different as a culture, as well as in specific areas of research, there is also a culture. But I think across different domains or research fields, they share the same term, right? They use the same term, but holds a different meaning. And then so that sense, I think that is one way to use it as a vehicle to understand one another through the different STEM fields. Another thing is I think literacy is quite interesting right now when it comes to like areas of like anime, manga, comics. They have their own language, they have their own representation, and it's interesting. It may have generated from one culture and then it's become very much universal and worldwide. And so looking at each of those features and how people interpret it and how it becomes a new set of language, culture, is I think quite interesting and is deeply related to the STEM stream area.
So I want to push back a little bit on the acronym and acronym usage. STEM to me started out sort of discipline oriented, thinking about disciplines that naturally use and make use of mathematics in some really meaningful way, applying mathematics and mathematical modeling to solve problems. You know, the inclusion of the arts or reading and writing, to me STEM was never meant to say these are the 4 things that we should focus on at the exclusion of others. STEM was never meant to say this is a political movement that's economically motivated. STEM to me was a thinking about disciplines that are already have some inherent connection and overlap, but not at the exclusion of other things. It's not to say that people who are in STEM disciplines don't use art. We see art as inspiration, you know, as people design technology and in using mathematics. We see these overlaps all the time. So STEM to me as an acronym wasn't trying to say these are you know, the things on which we should focus at the exclusion of others. And so I worry a little bit. I mean, I've had these conversations too. The inclusion of the A, to me, it's something just very different. To me, it means interdisciplinary. Adding the A is just simply making the claim that all education should think about interdisciplinary connections in a way that says that's important, and I absolutely agree. The inclusion of reading and writing to me is inherent in that. So is music. So is, you know, robotics or economics or statistics, all letters that we could add to this acronym that I think would say we're about being interdisciplinary. But is there a need for an acronym that incorporates all possible letters? I don't know. Again, I don't think it was, to me, STEAM stands for this idea of interdisciplinariness that includes arts and reading and writing and language. So.
Well, she's passing the microphone. I want to make one minor quibble because it's more fun if we argue a little bit, right? I do think that some of these things are motivated for political reasons, or they are kind of constructed intentionally to sort of say we should prioritize one more than the other. So I want to, you know, maybe argue with Nick on that. But I at the same time I want to agree with Nick in that I don't think, and I think others have said this, I don't think this is about STEM should become STEAM. And now STEAM should become STREAM. I think it's both and, right? I think STEM does a thing that's important. I think STEAM does a thing that's important, and STREAM might do a thing that's important. And it's not that we need to sort of get rid of the other one and do this new thing, but that they can each have their own sort of value and use, and the end.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Siegel, and I graduated from the Adult Learning and Leadership Program in 2012. I'm so glad we have this yearly to come back to. Thank you. I got the most out of Erica's story up front about the Frick, getting me to think about both together. And I'm sorry I'm calling you by your first names, Sandra. Also, on robotics, a robot is the whole thing, including if you make it cute enough. That's important. So I was going to talk about having been a comparative literature major who's worked at IBM for almost 27 years, and how that happened. And it doesn't matter because now I have to, and how I manage a team of learning scientists who used to be called learning designers, and how we've rebranded ourselves. I won't talk about that because I really want to come back to Nick's acronym. It reminds me so much of when people say, oh, for God's sake, LGBTQIA, you know, how long is this acronym going to get? It's about inclusion. So I actually really do love the idea of adding more and more letters explicitly, you know, whether we literally do that or whether we really just all agree that there really has to be like a mile-long acronym to include all these forms of learning. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jana Siegel. I'm alumni. I graduated in 2011 from the Cognitive Psychology in Education program, working closely with the Communication and Media program. So related to all this last comments, I feel that there is really a core problem that the domains in most traditional schools, less in the progressive one, are still separated, right? So there are maybe makerspace and genius hours that kind of trying to combine, and students can work on projects that are actually STEAM. But there seems like that the interdisciplinary is not natural enough for many teachers. So I'm running a nonprofit for interactive video platform, and I work with many teachers. And we encourage students to be scientists, activists, broadcasters. So they really actually integrating, and the teachers that working with us are teachers from across the domains. So it can be language or STEM, or even music teachers. So it's really interesting to see how they implement it in very different ways in their classrooms. But the one thing that I found challenging for some of the teachers, especially the ones that do not come from the STEM area, is that it's their domains are kind of isolated, and only in this Genius Hour or Makerspace they can implement these STEAM projects. And I wonder what you think about, I don't know, either defining a STEAM domain for itself, so we have specialists in STEAM, and that's how we push this forward, instead of having, because I do agree that you need to, you know, to teach this domain separately as well. But in where it comes together, it's many times in PBL projects, in progressive schools, that's how they teach. So it's more natural to them. It's interdisciplinary in the core. My kids go to Bank Street, and that's very much, you know, how they do it. But my question to you, like, how do we push it forward so it's more natural to teachers to incorporate that and not having it, again, as isolated domains?
I think a key ingredient is openness, and I feel we're seeing more and more openness in terms of STEAM and integrating STEAM in and out of school. There's also, on the one hand, there's a need for conceptual clarity, especially looking at the literature on STEAM and STEM. there's just so much disagreement. So on the one hand, yes, there is a need for conceptual clarity in some ways. In other ways, I do think that there's also an opportunity to rejoice in the disagreements. And STEAM itself is very context specific, right? So I do think there are some advantages in a certain kind of richness in really embracing the kind of STEAM that works for you and what it means for you and for your context. I do think we run into problems when we're talking about acronyms and thinking about the relationship between the S, T, E, A, and M. For instance, we often see STE brackets A, right, and the M, and that makes the A seem like an afterthought. And here I am quoting our doctoral student, Kyle Oliver, who yesterday tweeted for our STEAM wish tree, which, by the way, we're going to talk to you in a second about. So we have a STEAM wish tree that's going to be in our STEAMnasium from 1 to 4, and if you can't make it, you can also leave us a digital wish for STEAM. And his wish was that art should not be an afterthought with a capital A. And I do think that's something that we should keep in mind. And it was so well put.
If I could add one more, I don't think teachers have to use all of the STEAM or the stream. Right. I think they could pick and choose. I believe each of those are tools. Like in math, equations could be tools, technology, algorithm can be tools. And so carefully picking and choosing to fit your content area, I think is going to be much more effective than trying to incorporate all as a surface level. I think we should go in depth a little bit, and so I think it's that's part of the unique creation and design to be able to pick and choose to make it better.
I'll say.
I would just, I think there are so many different ways to think about this, and this is why we're having this year-long discussion in our department, because we're in this department together, mathematics, science, and technology, and we're often asked, and we do research, we write about STEM and STEAM, and we're asked to do professional development opportunities. So we really needed to have these conversations and get input from you, which you can do through our website, which I know Felicia's going to talk about. But I, as a lifelong teacher and just as a human being, I think the context matters. And I also think there are so many opportunities in the world to talk about all of these things together. So my favorite thing on the planet is probably the Brooklyn Bridge, for example, right? It's a work of art. It's beautiful. There's a lot of mathematics in it, the symmetry, the way the cables cross and create all these wonderful polygons, the science of dealing with the river currents and figuring out how deep they needed to put those pylons, the technology that was invented to basically build that bridge, and how it's one of the oldest bridges in New York, and it's probably in the best condition compared to some of the newer bridges. So just thinking about it, the Brooklyn Bridge, as an opportunity to talk about all of these things and to talk about history and politics that originally was made to connect two cities, Brooklyn and New York City, because of you see, I could talk about this ad nauseum. But the point is, what a rich discussion to have in a classroom with people of all ages, or in your home, or in your church or synagogue. And so I think I want to push us to think about times when it's appropriate to focus on mathematics. I'm always going to be in favor of that as a mathematics educator. But I think there are so many opportunities that we're not capitalizing on to talk about all of these things together, the poems that have been written about the Brooklyn Bridge that incorporate a lot of these ideas.
My name is Cathy Morin, and I'm sitting here smiling, sometimes laughing, because I'm old enough to remember where technology fit in at Teachers College in the 1970s and 80s, and it speaks to a lot of what you're talking about. And there's a funny backstory to it. Technology was always in the curriculum department, and I taught in the curriculum department, and I argued for technology to stay in the curriculum department. I came to Teachers College, excuse me, with a math physics background, went into the science department, and realized I wanted something much broader that I could take to the community. So I went into the curriculum department because of the technology. And I remember there were photography courses, self-instructional courses. It was a fantastic technology department within curriculum. And I can remember somebody saying once, technology is everywhere. Art has always had technology. It's always had science. You mix the paints, you prepare the medium that you're working. Technology is everywhere, and I get a little nutsy when I think that it's been pulled out. But one thing that was said was that when John Dewey was here, you have to look at technology in a historical context. High tech for John Dewey was a piece of chalk and a slate board. And I think that's something good to keep in mind. The idea of reading and writing, you go back, that was always there. Technology is integral to every subject area, every educational setting. And this is the humorous part. I think it's funny. I sat in on the meeting when the professors at department meeting decided to move technology out of curriculum and into the math and science department. And it had had nothing to do with technology. It was two professors not getting along. And one wanted to get away from the other. And people decided, so be it. So a lot of history, there's a backstory. And I have been dying to share that with you today.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a professional dancer, and I am also a public school teacher in District 75. And we serve children with severe to profound disabilities, and I work in grades K through 2 as the literacy through movement teacher. And honestly, I never really thought, oh, I use a STEAM approach until I sat in here and really reflected. And I want to just bring, we were asked to reflect on what does STEAM mean to us and what's our idea of STEAM. And I want to bring a lens of a special education teacher working with children with severe to profound disabilities, many who are nonverbal and severely cognitively delayed. And we talked about how that A kind of seems like an afterthought. But as I reflect, I lead with the A. So as a professional dancer, that's my entry point. Many of our students who are nonverbal, the arts give them a way to be able to show their understanding and learning through other avenues and other subjects. So we get to the science because we started with a song, and then we moved it into some movement, and we taught the life cycle of a frog. And so this all is so interrelated, and also with the stream and the reading and the writing. So as I just reflect on everything that everyone has said, that A is not an afterthought or a means to an end, but a means to get towards other learning in other areas. And I just wanted to share that.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Thank you. So I definitely want to thank everybody for coming to this panel to hear colleagues and yourselves to talk about what is STEM, what is STEAM, and for you to think even a little bit more purposely about the work that you're doing in these particular areas. But the conversation does not have to end here. So we have a beautiful website, and there it is there, where you have an opportunity to look at as it grows with us and our own thinking. But there's a survey at the bottom of the website, and we would like for you to go to the website and complete the survey, because it's going to give us some additional information to help us to think about as a department what we're going to be able to do. Yeah, I'm just going to scroll down. We also, a little bit later today, have our STEAM-nasium. So this is an opportunity for you to go and play, for you to engage yourself in some STEAM and STREAM, and maybe perhaps there are kinds of things that are going to be going on in the STEAMnasium. And we also have a beautiful STEAM wish tree. And this is also a chance for you to talk about writing down your wishes for STEAM education or even STEM education or anything else related to that you want to be able to do. So we're very excited about all the things we've been able to do as a department that's leading us into new directions, expanding our view of how we look at our work. But really for me, I think about it really in the context of the children. So everything that I do, everything I think about is for the children, and how we might be able to open up opportunities for them in STEM or STEAM, for them to think about the questions that they have that they're very curious about, and giving them the opportunity to grow and to learn. And so again, we're very appreciative to our colleagues who have sat on the panel, so let's give them a round of applause. We're also very thankful for you coming to share with us in this particular session, so give yourselves a round of applause. And just finally, enjoy the rest of the academic festival, and thank you for being here today with us. Thank you.